Hello, welcome or welcome back. My name is Ari and today we are going to do my August wrap-up. Now, if you're new to my channel and you've never done a wrap-up with me, I read a lot of books each month, so I try to quickly go through this wrap-up and I don't really get in detail about what I thought about each book. If you are interested in details about my opinion of these books, I do rate everything on Goodreads, so just hop down to my Goodreads channel down below and you can read the ratings. I will give you a general summary, general thoughts on what I thought of the books here, and if I read any of these books for a readathon, I will tell you which readathon and what prompt it filled. So jumping into it quickly right away, I ended up reading 24 books in August, 8,361 pages, which averages out to about 348 pages per book, or 279 pages per day. I read 9 books by male authors, 13 books by female authors, 1 book by multiple authors who are both male and female, and 1 book by a non-binary author. I read 12 books as physical copies, 7 ebooks, 2 audiobooks, and 3 books that I read partially as an audiobook and partially as either a physical or ebook copy. 20 of the books I read were adult novels and 4 of them were young adult novels. I didn't read anything but adult and young adult. As far as genres, I had 10 of them that were horror or thriller novels, 4 that were just general fiction, 3 fantasy, 1 romance, 2 nonfiction, and 4 science fiction. 10 of the books that I read were for my Century Challenge, where I read 1 book published every year from 1900 to 2020. For August it was the 1970s, and I created an entire separate wrap-up for that. You can find that video linked up in the eye. I did end up reading 5 arcs this month. All 5 of them, nope. 4 of them were from NetGalley, and then 1 of them was from Libro FM. I am affiliated with Libro FM as part of their influencer program. If you are interested in signing up for them and ditching Audible, the link's down below. If you don't know what Libro FM is, they do audiobooks. It's the same price as Audible, but they support small indie-owned bookstores instead of Amazon, which is why I use them over Audible. The first NetGalley arc I read was The Shadows by Alex North. I had an audio copy of this on NetGalley, and then I got the physical copy from Book of the Month Club. So this was okay. You're gonna get that a whole lot this month. Most of what I read was okay. It was a horror thriller about a adult who, as a child, a bunch of murders happened that his best friend committed, and then the friend went missing. They never caught him and arrested him, and he's been missing for I don't know, 15 or more years, and then copycat murders start happening, and that's what this is about. I was very meh about the twist and the thriller parts of this. Maybe it just isn't my thing. Next up on audiobook, I read Girl, Serpent, Thorn, and this was one of the better books that I read this month. This is very generic young adult fantasy, but it's told, or it's a Persian story instead of generic white people stories, so I very, very much enjoyed it. the princess is also like the bad guy. She's not really a bad guy. She's just kills everybody she touches. So it was a very interesting twist on like a princess fairy tale type, but it was still a very generic young adult fantasy tale. So if you don't like generic young adult fantasy, you won't like this, but if you do, this was a really, really great book. I think I'm going to try to find, or I think I'm going to buy a physical copy of this because I did very, very much enjoy it. Next up from Libro FM, I read Harrow the Ninth, which is the sequel to Gideon the Ninth, which Gideon the Ninth was my favorite book of the year so far. This I didn't like. Unfortunately, apparently what I really liked about Gideon was reading from Gideon's perspective, and Gideon is missing from this book because this is from Harrow's perspective, not Gideon's. So yeah, I didn't really like this. Harrow is also going insane in this book, and reading it from her perspective as she goes insane makes it very hard to follow. I didn't hate it. I was just vastly disappointed because I loved Gideon the Ninth so much. I also have a copy of this on Libro FM as an audiobook. I barely listened to any of the audiobook. I mostly physically read it, but when I did listen to the audiobook, I enjoyed the narrator. So I still think you should probably pick this up as a physical book because it's just so confusing. You're gonna have a hard time keeping up with it in physical, much less as an audiobook. Next up, I read Rediscovery, Science Fiction by Women from 1958 to 1963. This was an arc on NetGalley, but it got published last year, so it's been out for a very long time. This is short stories collected from like magazines and of fantasy short stories, fantasy and science fiction stories from like that time period of 1958 through 1963. These were all written and published by women. And it's one of those things, like it's an anthology, so some of them were really good and some of them were very meh. The first story, which I don't remember the name of off the top of my head, was my favorite, absolute favorite, and the last story was really, really good as well. So if you were interested in classical sci-fi written by women instead of like white men, which is mostly what you get, I would definitely recommend picking this up. It's a really cool introduction to just some classic sci-fi, and there's nothing wrong with that. Next up, I read Gender Rebels by Annika Harry, I think is how you say her name. This is a very interesting book, and the reviews of this are very, very polarizing. It has a fairly low Goodreads score, but I think that's because people who are very, very aware of history are going in and reading this, and they're not reading it for what it is. Like, this isn't an end-all be-all, like, historically perfect recollection of women who were either trans men or just powerful women in history. This is like a few short little pages that are kind of a basic introduction to women who behaved as men when women historically did not have the right to do any fucking thing at all. And it's humorous. Like, you've got to go into this right. Also, this doesn't judge, like, some of these women are really shitty human beings, like, just straight up shitty human beings, and it doesn't really discuss about, like, what they were doing makes them shitty human beings. it just discuss, or it's literally just about women who take on the role, or take on the historic role of a man, and they don't let men bring them down. I very much enjoyed the audiobook of it, except for like NetGalley's audio thing was bugged. So a lot of these I had to like, I couldn't get it to play a lot of the chapters, so I ended up having to physically read it. And like I said, I really enjoyed this, but a lot of people don't. So if you're like very stickler for history, you want to know humor in your history, and you want discussions about like what these people did was like historically accurate but maybe negative, then this isn't for you. There are women here who were like Nazis and women who fought for the South in the American Civil War. Like, some of these women were awful. Some of them were pirates. That's not what this is about. This is literally women who took on a historically masculine role, but funny. Some people didn't appreciate the jokes on Goodread either. I enjoyed the jokes, but some people really did not appreciate the jokes in here. So this is one of my more favorite books of the month, but it definitely is not for everybody. Next up, from August 1st through 8th, there was a readathon called Book Hibernation. So like Hibear, not hibernation. It's a pun. I had an entire vlog on this, so I'm just going to quickly run through the books, but if you want like more detailed descriptions of like what I thought about the books, they will be in that vlog, linked up in the eye and down in the description below. So the first book that I read for this was How to Be Less Stupid About Race. This is nonfiction about racism. Next, I read Ice Planet Barbarians, which is like fantasy romance that has been going around, like making its rounds on BookTube. It's really popular with a lot of people who don't normally read like smutty romance. After that, I read Dark Fever, which is the first book in a series about a woman who is fighting Fae. And it's paranormal romance kind of, but there is literally zero romance in the first book. You're not going to hit the paranormal romance until later in the series. This one was a reread for me. I've read the whole series, so that's why I know there's paranormal romance. But the first one is just fantasy involving evil Fae. After that, I read Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. This is an older book from the 70s about a vampire, and he's being interviewed and he's telling about his life. There's a really famous movie with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. After that, I read Aurora Burning by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This is the sequel to Aurora Rising, and this is young adult sci-fi. And the final book that I read was Jaws. You know, the one about the shark. This was the most trash 1-star book ever. Don't read it. Like, straight up never read this. Next up is my Newts. So Newts is a yearly, like a biannual readathon that Book Roast does, that G from Book Roast does, and in the spring you do your owls, and then the summer you do your Newts. This is based off of the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, and this is the last ever Newts that is going to exist, because the author of the Harry Potter series, if you are not aware, is a piece of trash, and she keeps like saying horrible things about trans women on Twitter, and we've canceled her. So I didn't really do a whole lot socially with this because I don't want to support J.K. Rowling anymore at all. So I will do my best not to speak about anything Harry Potter after this. I just kind of wanted to make you aware of why, because I see a lot of videos where they're like, we don't talk about J.K. Rowling, but they won't tell you why and just expect you to know. I don't expect you to know. She's transphobic and I stand in solidarity with trans people and support them over supporting her. The only reason I did this did the Newts is because of the community behind it. G, I believe, is going to redo this readathon and make it non-Harry Potter themed going forward. I just wanted to take part in this last one with the community and say fuck you to J.K. Rowling. So for the Newts, I did the alchemist career, and that required, the requirement for that was to read 17 different books. It's the biggest career that you could possibly take. I required to get an O in Ancient Runes, which means I had to read 3 books, A, E, and O. So for an A in Ancient Runes, I had to read a book where the author's name starts with a B, which could be first or last name. And for that, I read The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. So, B. Next up, for E in Ancient Ruins, I needed to read a classic, and for that I read a short story called Desiree's Baby by Kate Chopin. I have that in this collection, bind up by her. It was a very short story about a woman in Louisiana who basically was a foundling, and she was raised by a wealthy white family, and she gets married to a wealthy white man and then has a child who is of mixed race. And then that's kind of like the turning point in the story. I don't want to say more because it's a short story. It's short. You don't get a whole lot more than that. But yeah, that was a very, very well written story. I'm very much looking forward to reading more by Kate Chopin in the future. Next up for O was Love Ruin, and to read a romance. For that, I read Jacqueline Susan's Once Is Not Enough, which technically is a romance, but it's just a romance about daddy issues, so not a fan. Next up for arithmancy, I also needed an O in arithmancy. For A, I read a non-fiction book, and that was How to Be Less Stupid About Race. After that, for E in arithmancy, a book that ends in an odd number. And for that, I read Stephen King's Salem's Lot, which has 631 pages. For an O in arithmancy, I needed to read a book between 260 and 299 pages, and for that I read Requiem for a Dream, which has, I don't remember how many pages, but I'll tell you in a second, which had 292 pages. Next prompt was Herbology, and I again needed an O in Herbology, and the first prompt was a book with flowers on the cover. For that I read Flowers in the Attic, which was incest trash. Next up for an E in Herbology, I needed a book that might be impactful. For this book, my goal was to read a book featuring a trans character, because fuck J.K. Rowling. And I succeeded in that and read An Unkindness of Ghost, which is a science fiction that deals a lot with asexual characters, trans characters, women's rights and women of color. So if you haven't read this book and you like sci-fi, I highly recommend it. For an O in Herbology, I needed to read a book that was longer than my previous read. And for that, I read Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. Turn of the Key was 337 pages, and I read it directly after I finished Ice Planet Barbarians, which was 188 pages. The next class was Potions, and again, I needed an O in Potions. The first prompt is a book with sky on the cover or in the title. For that, I read Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. There's a sun in the title. There's a sunset, or not in the title. On the cover, there's a sunset, which is the sky. I mean, I'm right. Next up, E in Potions, I needed a book where the author's name starts with D. For this, I read Ice Planet Barbarians by Ruby Dixon. So, Dixon, D, there you go. An O in Potions, I needed a book over 450 pages. For that, I read The Bourne Identity by Robert Ludlum, which has 566 pages. So, 116 pages over 450. The next class was Transfigurations. As expected, I needed an O in Transfigurations as well. The first prompt was a book with an animal on the cover or in the title, and I read Jaws. Again, Jaws is a trash book. It's a 1 star. Never read it. Fuck this author. For an E in Transfigurations, I needed to read a book that had dragons or fire on the cover. And for that, I read Aurora Burning. I don't know how well this is going to translate through the camera, but all in the background, it's like flames and sparks and stuff like that. If you can see that, we got a fire in the background there. Next up is an O in Transfigurations, and I needed a book that's a hardcover. For that, I read The Shadows, which it's a hardcover. And the final class I took, I only needed an E in instead of an O, which is Astronomy. And the first prompt for that was to read a book with a star on the cover. I read This Coven Won't Break by Isabel Sterling. This is the sequel to These Witches Don't Burn. I didn't like it as much as the first book, which is exactly how I felt about Harrow the Ninth, Aurora Burning, and this book. So all of these sequels that I really wanted to read this month, I didn't like as much as the first book, and my disappointment is immeasurable. But I don't know if you can see it from back there. There is a star right there on the cover. And for the final prompt, we have a science fiction book. And I've read a lot of science fiction, as you could tell already, but for that one I chose Harrow the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. Again, it's an immense disappointment. Shit happens. Next up, my monthly book club. I take part in Belle's book club every month on Instagram, and we, as like a group, pick a theme for the month, and then Belle comes up with 3 books that fit that theme, and then we vote on which one to read. For August, we ended up reading The Stranger by Harlan Coben. This is a thriller. Again, it was okay. I didn't like the ending of it. Like, I liked it until I got to the end. So, take that how you will. You might like it if you like thrillers. This is a very personalized, like, issue with the book, is that I didn't like the ending of it, but you might like the ending of it. And that's everything. That's all 24 books that I read this month. let me know what you think about these books down in the comments. And again, if you want more details on any of these, hit up my Goodreads where I have like the full review of each book. And I will see you in the next video, which will probably be an unboxing. Are we feeling a Coffee and a Classic unboxing next? I think so. Bye!